Hi everyone. With this video, I thought I'd talk a little bit about Alien Covenant again, given that I've had some time to sort of think about it and sort of sit back and watch people ask questions that may or may not be interesting to answer in the film. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll go to the AVP Galaxy forums and just read the threads on there and talk to people about what they liked about the film, what they didn't like about the film. And one thing that got mentioned recently on a thread, Ridley Scott talks the return of the engineers. That's something I wanted to discuss, but specifically one thing that came up by 426 Buddy was, I think Orm felt confident with his weapon in hand, especially having killed the neomorph already. Curiosity killed the Crudup. And he goes on to say, personally, I would have preferred David to have torn Orm's weapon away, then drag him over to an egg and force him to look into it as it opens. That would have been terrifying in my opinion, but the way it is now doesn't bother me much, just a missed opportunity. And I thought, is there a better way to do a scene? 9 times out of 10, I will say that I like the way that it is, but potentially there is something out there that is better that they could have done. And on the flip side, there are things out there that are worse.
My husband is having an affair with your wife. I don't think we should talk about it. There's your pet. Kill them.
Oh man. Oh God. Oh man. Oh God. Oh man. Oh God. Oh man. Oh God. Oh man. Oh God.
So it really depends on the scene. There wasn't really anything in the movie that I felt as though they could have done better, in the sense that I felt like we got the worst possible way that they could have done a scene. One of my complaints with the film, of course, was the editing. This wasn't so much what we got, but rather what we didn't get in regards to what could have been added to what was already there. The third act, in my opinion, would have been perfectly fine had they allowed it more time to sort of build up to the kind of reveal or shock that they had wanted in regards to Lope's character being face-hugged. We barely have time to register that he's been face-hugged before they remove it from him and take him back to the ship. And by the time they're on board the Covenant, we never see him again, and almost no time passes between Daniels going to her cabin as the newly coined captain of the Covenant to be awoken by Mother to go to the med bay to discover that Lope has since expired and all we see is his body. And someone pointed out to me that he was so badly injured in the face area and the way that it was shot that it's difficult at first glance to even recognize him because it's such a state of bloody carnage. And it would have been nice, I feel, as though they could have built up to that more. But in regards to the scene with Orm having the gun and not wanting to shoot David right off the bat, he wanted some answers, and he said that if he didn't get those answers that he would have shot David. This to me made sense, but I will say that if David wanted to, I think he very easily could have removed Orm's weapon from him. He could have disarmed him in the same sense that in Terminator 2, the man comes out of the bar with the lever-action shotgun and says,
"Can't let you take the man's wheels, son. Now get off before I put you down."
At which point, Arnold disarms him despite being held up at gunpoint. David, later in the film, had no difficulty easily disarming Daniels, who had a pistol pointed at him point blank. Granted, she was holding a pistol in one hand, Orm was holding a rifle in 2 hands, but given how fast and strong David is, as is demonstrated in the film, I think that he would have had no trouble disarming Orm. And you have to say to yourself, well, he could have disarmed Orm, and he could have held his face up to an egg. But it also demonstrates again that Orm is a curious character. Despite his better judgment, his curiosity gets the better of him, And as 426 Buddy says, curiosity killed the Crudup. He was a flawed character. Now, people say that this kind of behavior is stupid, and they're not wrong, but I don't feel as though it interferes with the narrative of the film in the same sense that you have Achilles, where Achilles has an Achilles heel, and you could say, well, he's exhibiting stupid behavior, and look at him, he's just going on murderous rampage after murderous rampage, and eventually it leads to his downfall, you know, that hubris. So in the case of Achilles, it's hubris. In the case of Crudup, it's a false sense of security or overconfidence by having the weapon. And perhaps this is why David let him keep the weapon. He didn't disarm him because he thought to himself, well, if I let him keep the weapon, I could very easily take it away from him. But I'll let him keep it. He's not going to shoot me until he has answers. And I'm going to put him into a situation where he'll be potentially unable to resist what I provide. When the egg opens, I may not even have to hold his face up to the opening egg so that he gets impregnated. He may do it himself because perhaps David is just that good a judge of character. He's very good at reading people. He's very good at manipulating people. And is it perhaps terrifying that the possibility that David could have forced his face up to the egg and he could have been squirming and struggling and resisting? Yes, that is one way to go about it. But from a certain point of view, he almost comes off as more manipulative, more persuasive by being able to essentially allow Orm to keep the gun and not get shot because he's that cool of a customer and he understands Orm that well. And given Orm's other behavior in the film, he is the captain who inherits his power from someone else, who is constantly feeling as though he's put into a situation where he isn't respected, that people don't trust him, and he's constantly trying to prove himself. And perhaps it appeals to his shortcomings as an officer that he be given the opportunity. Well, I submit to your wishes, Captain Orm. Allow me to give you what you want. And again, David is appealing to Orm's hubris in this situation and allowing him to keep his weapon, which is just another way to skin the same old cat. Yes, he could have disarmed him in brute-like fashion, but perhaps it's more fitting of his character as a manipulator and a master actor with a poker face that he allow him to keep his weapon and still meet the same objective. So that's what I think about that. What else is there going on? In regards to Ridley Scott hinting at a sequel, this is something that I wanted to talk about. In regards to the performance of the film, a lot of people said that the movie hasn't done very well, and they're sort of clamoring for someone else to take over. When James Cameron made Aliens, I always felt that Alien was kind of a standalone film. There are a lot of things that are left up to the viewer's imagination in regards to the space jockey, in regards to some of the motives of Ash with the magazine and why he was essentially face raping Ripley with that. It doesn't really seem to sort of fit. Unless you're trying to come up with some type of explanation in regards to him having some type of glitch that manifests in the form of sexual frustration, which seems curiously out of place given that he's an android. And Ridley Scott in the commentary for Alien even says, you know, this scene kind of suggests or insinuates or asks the question, do androids experience sexual desires? And this is something that I feel that Scott exhibits, or I feel that Scott explores in Alien Covenant further. David has Daniels on the table and she asks, what did you do to Shaw? To which he responds, the same thing that I'm going to do to you. And I can't remember if he said that before or after she was on the table. Regardless, it seemed to insinuate that he was going to sexually violate her in some form. And even if David didn't sexually violate Shaw in the way that you might think would be the traditional method via penetration and rape, he certainly took her sexual organs and used them in a way that I don't think she would have approved of. So it's a different kind of rape, where he took her eggs and essentially used them to create these abortive offshoots or monstrosities in such a way that perhaps women look upon children that are produced from rape, a rape baby, for instance, where it is difficult in certain situations, I think, for the mother to love the child because it reminds her of being raped. And so, in that sense, I do think that David very much raped Shaw. He betrayed her, he killed her, and he misused her sexual organs to create something that she would have found difficult in loving herself. And in the same sense, you have David on top of Daniels on the table in his laboratory or thereabouts, or the Hall of Records, and he is kissing her and says, "That's how this is done, isn't it?" And of course, it's obviously not how it is done, at least not in a way that's consensual, and it's obvious that Daniels isn't consenting. So again, it's Ridley Scott exploring the idea, do androids experience sexual feelings? And if they do, perhaps they don't experience them the same way that we do as humans. That's not to say that humans, of course, don't rape each other or sexually violate each other. And perhaps that's what Ridley Scott is saying. Look, this isn't David being an android who's incapable of experiencing healthy sexual emotions. Perhaps he is more human than we think, because to be human is to exhibit violent tendencies from time to time. There is certainly no shortage of individuals out there, human, who are capable of raping others or abusing others or murdering others. So when David is exhibiting these, it's not demonstrating his lack of humanity. I think it's more demonstrating his possession of humanity, merely the violent sides of humanity, but certainly humanity nonetheless.
There are 7 deadly sins, Captain. Gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, pride, lust, and envy.
So, in regards to all of that, however, it was mostly self-contained in regards to Alien. Being a film, it very easily could have ended right then and there. Ridley defeats the monster and she flies off into outer space, confident that she will be picked up once she reaches civilization.
I should reach the frontier in about 6 weeks. With a little luck, the network will pick me up.
In regards to that, it could have ended right then and there. So when James Cameron made Aliens, he was building on something that was essentially finished. It didn't need a sequel, in the same sense that Halloween didn't need a sequel. Jaws didn't need a sequel. And yet, in the case of James Cameron's Aliens, what we got was a very good film. And in the case of course, Halloween and Jaws, what we got were inferior sequels that weren't really necessary. And I will say that Aliens was not necessary, however, it was very well made. And in my opinion, it didn't really answer a lot of the questions that were posed by Ridley Scott in Aliens in regards to, say, Ash's behavior. James Cameron wasn't really interested in exploring a lot of the themes that Ridley Scott had explored in Alien, pertaining to the behavior of the androids. And in Alien Covenant and Prometheus, it's very front and center, the kind of stuff that Ridley Scott is interested in. The same kind of stuff that he was exploring in Alien. People really don't mention that, when they're comparing the films. A lot of people, when they compare Alien to Alien Covenant or Prometheus, they just say, well, Alien is a better film. But they never really stop and consider that maybe Ridley Scott is just taking the story in a direction that he was kind of interested in when he made Alien, in regards to Ash's weird, deviant sort of sexual tendencies in Alien, which are never really explained and never touched on in Aliens. When James Cameron did Aliens, he just sort of did his own thing, and he made Bishop a very friendly android. The A2s were always twitchy, but they never say why. They just say, oh, he malfunctioned. Malfunctioned?
Well, that explains it, and the A2s always were a bit twitchy. That could never happen now with our behavioral inhibitors. It is impossible for me to harm, or by mission of action allow to be harmed, a human being. You sure you don't want some?
James Cameron's direction was very different as far as that goes. And then with Ridley Scott, I don't think he's taking the story in a new direction. He's picking up where he left off. Had he been given a chance to make Alien 2, as opposed to James Cameron being allowed to make Aliens, I think that Scott would have made a film that took the story in similar directions that Prometheus and Alien Covenant did in regards to the exploration of the alien universe, in regards to Ash, in regards to David, because Ridley Scott was a huge fan, if you will, of 2001: A Space Odyssey and the exploration of artificial intelligence versus humanity. You know, can a parallel intelligence exhibit similar human tendencies to its human counterparts? And of course, in 2001: A Space Odyssey, it was a disembodied human voice, whereas in Alien Covenant and Prometheus, you have David, who is made in our image, essentially. So I don't really think that what we're seeing in the sequels is anything that we wouldn't have seen by Scott, say, 40 years ago, had he been allowed to make a sequel to Alien. And when people say that he's taken the series in a new direction, I don't think that he's taking it in a direction that he wouldn't have taken it in had he been given the green light all those decades ago. So as far as a sequel being made and people saying that, you know, Scott is taking it in a completely new direction, I disagree. I would say that his direction in regards to the exploration of David as a central character doesn't come as the slightest surprise to me, because that was something that was on the forefront of Scott's mind when he was making Alien. You know, you had Ash, you had this very curious sort of behavior from Ash, and you say, well, Ash was insane. You also have to keep in mind that David is insane as well. And Prometheus, it's masked a little bit because of his servitude to his human master, Wayland, but as soon as that is taken away, you have to ask what happens. He's a lot more dangerous when the head is put back on and he doesn't have someone giving him orders. What will he be capable of? In the same sense that you have to ask yourself, how would Ash have behaved had he not been given any sort of orders? And he admired the creature and he was sort of going out of his way to help it, and you have to say that, okay, he was acting under orders in the same sense David was. But what if you substituted David with Ash in Alien Covenant? Would he have acted any differently? The A2s, of course, were a different model to the David 8 model, and then you have Walter after that, and then at some point they arrive at Ash, who is his own type of android.
Hyperdyne Systems 128.2.
And I don't know if he's more or less advanced than either of those models, in the sense that it's not, the technological progression isn't what you think it is, in regards to it just gets better and better and better, because you'll notice David is more human than Walter is. Walter is a later model. They add certain safeguards and sort of dial down his humanity to make him less uncanny. And then when you look at Ash and Alien, you have to ask yourself, okay, where does he fit on that spectrum? But one thing that they all sort of have in common is an exploration of the humanity through a non-human persona, a simulacrum, if you will, in regards to Ridley is really interested in answering some of these questions, and it's more philosophical in the same sense that if you were to watch Ghost in the Shell, where you have these things that aren't really human but feel human, or Blade Runner, something like that, where it's more philosophical. And in, of course, Alien, it's not entirely front and center because Ash is kind of a lateral character. He's off to the side doing his own thing, and these things sort of come out as surprises, and he's not given a lot of screen time, whereas David in Alien Covenant is given center stage. So imagine, if you will, Alien, where Ash had center stage and he was the central character. He wasn't in that case because it was a different film. I think its focus was more horror, Gothic horror specifically, whereas Alien Covenant, the focus has shifted on things that I think Ridley Scott was interested in more directly. And some people aren't interested in this, they just want a retread, you know, the horror elements and things of that nature. Whereas Scott, of course, is taking the story in the direction that he wants, and given that I'm a huge fan of, say, Ghost in the Shell or Blade Runner, or any kind of movie like that, that sort of grasps at these philosophical conundrums through a science fiction sort of lens.
Can you offer me proof of your existence? How can you, when neither modern science nor philosophy can explain what life is.
I really like that. And I was a huge fan of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and I like that you have a director, a science fiction director, who is addressing these issues present in that film through his own movies. It's essentially a discourse between two directors from different periods across time. It's communication through art, and I really like that. And yes, it's not commercially what people expect in regards to, oh, I wanted Aliens version 2.0, or I wanted something equivalent to Alien. Well, obviously, that's not the direction that Scott's interested in, but he's the director, he's the governor, and he is essentially in control here creatively. And I personally don't have a problem with that. With an interview posted on avpgalaxy.net, where Corporal Hicks, the administrator for the website, says, in a recent interview with Ridley Scott recorded during Alien Covenant press junket, Scott talks a little about what he has in store for the Alien Covenant sequel. There will be 3 or 4 different players coming in to investigate, one of which will be the engineers arriving back to find their planet decimated. I think those ships come and go on regular intervals. I see them as the gardeners of space, which is interesting. It almost makes me think of the super carrot from the Thing from Another World. And in regards to, okay, we tend to see ourselves as animals, but what if we could be cultivated or grown? Like in the Matrix, we humans are not born, we are grown. And that's the horror of that realization, and it sort of levels us and makes us seem less like gods and more like commodities for powerful deities that see us as something to cultivate and use at their every whim. So the idea that Scott is sort of taking the series, he's building up to this conclusion where you have this android with hubris, and you have the engineers who have been largely vacant for the first 2 films. Well, they finally come to play in a Sean Connery film, Outland, where I believe they were on a moon orbiting Jupiter, and they had a mining colony, and they send these assassins. For a large amount of the film, you're waiting for the assassins to come. And you spend a lot of time looking at the door, and there's a countdown. They're talking about the arrival of these assassins, and there's a lot of build-up. And that all takes place in one film, whereas in Ridley Scott's prequels, you have essentially 2 films where these creators are absent, and then finally they come up in the 3rd film, and they show up to investigate. And it doesn't create the same kind of tension in film, of course. It's tension along a larger sort of macroscopic scale where you're waiting throughout the series for these aliens to show up, so it doesn't have the same kind of effect. But it doesn't mean that it's not exciting as far as I'm concerned. Okay, I'm interested in seeing how this unfolds. And where you have aliens who are alive, which is always a tricky subject, because if you keep them dead, you can keep them mysterious, and it's a lot easier to do it in a way that isn't sort of laughable. You know, you have the wrong special effects. You have to write it a certain way, because if you have a movie like Independence Day, where you have the communication between the president and the downed pilot in Area 51, it doesn't really have that kind of effect that you would think. Sort of like if you imagine meeting a great old one, where you shouldn't be able to just have this easy, straightforward conversation. You're in the presence of something from another world that is beyond your understanding, that is greater than you. It should not be a straightforward conversation, and you should feel that on screen, but that's a difficult feeling to cultivate, and it takes a lot of good filmmaking. And can Ridley Scott pull it off? I don't know. The aliens in Alien Covenant are by and large stupid monsters, essentially. You know, they're the children of Lilith, essentially. You know, they're demonic offspring produced by David, the android, in his mad scientific experiments. But I think the engineers are going to be radically different than that. In Prometheus, of course, you had the last engineer that they wake up who was subject to great rage, but of course we don't know what David said to him to sort of instigate that attack. But we also can't assume that all engineers act like him. He was biomechanical, and there were other engineers present in the film who were not. The sacrificial engineer, the elders, the spacecraft that flies vertically up through the clouds. There are a lot of things that were radically different than that. So I'm not going to assume that the engineers that we see in Alien Awakening are anything like the engineer that we saw in Prometheus. And I'm really curious to see how that goes down. And then, of course, you probably have another batch of humans who have come to sort of investigate in regards to what's going on. You have Tennessee and Daniels, who are still alive. They're prisoners at this point, in the same sense that Han Solo was a prisoner at the end of Empire Strikes Back in Star Wars. You know, their fate is unknown. It seems as though they're doomed, but maybe they're not, and maybe Scott will have them wake up and escape, or maybe they'll go the same way that happened with Shaw. There's just no way to know. Though in Shaw's case, she thought that she was going to be fine at the end of Prometheus. She was still searching, and it ended very optimistically. Well, she was a naive idiot, and David played her for a sap, whereas Daniels and Tennessee knew that David was not untrustworthy. So the way that movie ends is completely different. So the conclusion could be different. Perhaps they are taken prisoner and they are not operated on initially. They are allowed to sort of survive. Because you also have to keep in mind there are a lot of other human hosts on board the Covenant that David could experiment or operate on. And perhaps he doesn't necessarily want to destroy Daniels right away, in the same sense that in Halloween, Michael Myers keeps Laurie Strode alive. He doesn't just walk up to her and kill her immediately. Rather, he kills everyone around her to make her feel as afraid as possible, to cultivate these feelings of doom. And that is the point. When you're stalking someone, when you're haunting them, oftentimes the objectives isn't to kill the person outright, but to terrify them to unknown extremes. And I think that's probably the fate that lies in store for Daniels and or Tennessee. And perhaps while David is cultivating these feelings of dread and doom, they are able to escape when the engineers show up. Perhaps they track the ship. Perhaps there was something on board the Covenant that sort of gloms on to it merely by being in presence with this alien world. Perhaps they're able to trace it. Perhaps they just run into each other, two ships passing in the night, in the same sense that in Aliens you have Ellen Ripley, who's floating past the core systems out there for 57 years, and lo and behold, a deep salvage team finds her when they did, and what are the odds? 1 in 1,000, really? I mean, you could have been floating out there forever. So perhaps something similar happens to David. You know, he's not intending on being found. It's not like the ship has a cloaking device, and perhaps the aliens just find him. You know, they are the masters of the universe, right? So perhaps they're like, hey, what's this ship flying through our star systems? Let's take a look. And then at the same time, they perhaps have some type of wanted poster, you know, wanted, dead or alive, David, you know, or whoever destroyed our alien planet. Perhaps they're sort of, they flag his ship down and say, hey, someone destroyed our planet, and you look awfully familiar. You know, so something like that. And, you know, that's sort of a Western way of interpreting what could happen. But it seems like something Scott would do. And at the same time, though, I'm really hoping that the aliens themselves are unknowable. That it's not like District 9, where you have the bugs who are essentially human analogs in Johannesburg. You know, the prawns, who are essentially the indigenous population of Africa being subjugated by the imperialistic Afrikaans. And with something like that, and you have a lot of time where they're on screen and they're talking, and you're like, okay, well, these are basically insect surrogates for human analogs. So I'm kind of hoping that we don't get that with the engineers, that they're a lot more great old one-y. You know, when they're presented on screen, there isn't just a straightforward conversation. And in Prometheus, I really liked how that went down, when you have the single conversation between David and Wayland and the last engineer, where they have a conversation and you don't know what they say, and some shit goes down and you don't fully understand it. Like, I think Scott did a really good job with that in Prometheus, and I only hope that they extend that in Alien Covenant 2 or the sequel, whatever it's called, because I heard that Alien Awakening was supposed to take place before Covenant. So I'm hoping they move the story forward. Based on this interview, they talk about the planet already being decimated. So it sounds like it's just going to be a continuation or a sequel. And I'm hoping that the presence of the engineers is felt powerfully, but it remains kind of mysterious. So they have plenty of reasons to be upset at this point, but perhaps we'll see different sides of them and not just the biomechanical soldiers. So I'm really looking forward to that. In Prometheus, you had the engineers running around in their spacesuits and the holograms in the tunnel, and Fifield says, "What the hell was that? Whose bright idea wasn't to not bring any weapons," that kind of thing. And we see the engineers running, and they have their elephant trunk suits. I really hope we see some more of that, just because from a special effects standpoint, I think that's really interesting. I also hope that in regards to their presence on screen, we also see things that we haven't seen of them before, at least not as much, like the engineer elders, or female engineers, if there are any, or engineer pets, in regards to maybe they have certain subjugated biomechanical organisms, in the sense that the last engineer had a biomechanical suit. Maybe they have their own form of alien technology, like the alien ship and Alien, the derelict craft, had biomechanical eggs. And perhaps the engineers have already cultivated a monster that David has sort of set as his own. He's created this using wasps and other technology, using whatever resources he had on his planet. My sister-in-law, Emily, would call it grog, where essentially you're in a kitchen and you only have random shit available, and yet you try and follow a recipe using random kitchen supplies. And it's the same idea. David has essentially made the grog equivalent of a xenomorph. But what if the engineers who show up to investigate have already perfected the recipe, and they brought some cultivated, subjugated, indoctrinated xenomorphs to play, in the same sense that in H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, you have the Shoggoth. And you had this powerful civilization that was at its zenith, and they had subjugated the Shoggoth that they made. And then, of course, they were designed to fight Cthulhu, if I remember correctly, in that particular narrative. And eventually the civilization weakens, and then they lose control of their own weapons. And I wonder if when the engineers come to investigate in the sequel by Ridley Scott, they will have cultivated their own bioweapon using the same technology. It's a military version. And, of course, when we saw Alien Covenant and David deployed the bomb, what we saw was something that produced the neomorphs. I mean, the neomorphs were the direct result of the spores that came from the weapon that David deployed. He didn't modify that. He deployed it the way the engineers would have designed it. So if the engineer from Prometheus made it to Earth carrying death and he dropped a payload of bombs, it would have wiped out this entire ecosystem, essentially, and introduced these spores into the plants that would have produced neomorphs to any animals surviving that came into contact. So those weren't, as far as I understand it, a byproduct of David's genius. Those were engineer weapons. And the xenomorph that he created was of his own sort of flavor. But I have to feel as though, again, he is essentially doing what the engineers would do, except in his case, he's using whatever ingredients he has. But the DNA that he used from Shaw's eggs is identical to engineer DNA, which makes me think that, again, what he's doing isn't that original, and that the engineers who come to investigate in the sequel could have their own perfected, militarized version of the xenomorph that's biomechanical, in the same sense that the last engineer in Prometheus was biomechanical. So there's no way to really say. It's obviously very early, but in regards to the performance of Alien Covenant, I thought that the film is actually doing better than I thought in regards to its performance, in regards to how much money it's made, how much it cost to make. If I go on to Box Office Mojo, for instance, and I look at its domestic total as of June 25th, the worldwide sum is $227,814,263. So it's not doing as well as Prometheus did. It was also, however, cheaper to make than Prometheus. the production budget was about 3/4 of what that film cost to make. It made less money, and it's also cheaper to make. And of course, it's going on in China. It hasn't been released in Japan yet. So I would hazard to guess that by the time all is said and done and it has run its course in China, in Japan, and any other market that hasn't opened yet, that it'll be closer to, say, $300 million. That's just an estimate. That's a guess. Is that enough to merit a sequel? I think, given that you also have DVD sales to take into consideration and the possibility of having a director's cut or a making-of featurette in the same sense that you had Furious Gods with Prometheus. They did very well in regards to DVD sales for that film. And with Alien Covenant, they could possibly capture that type of success again, only giving them further incentive to have the excuse that they need to go ahead with a sequel. And in regards to the money that the film's already produced, in regards to its budget and everything that it's already pulled in, I think they already have more than enough justification to make a sequel, but there's further things down the pipe that are going to give them further incentive. Scott is, of course, very steadfastly pursuing this idea. You know, he very much wants to make another film, or at least introduce the possibility of another film with a director of his choice. Perhaps Luke Scott will take up the reins. But if I were a betting man, I would happily bet money on Scott himself finishing this out. It's his baby. It's his idea. He's taking the series in a direction that he very much wants to explore, even if James Cameron wasn't interested in it with Aliens. You know, he has Avatar now. He obviously had his own sort of story that he wanted to tell, and Scott has his own story that he wants to tell. So in regards to a sequel, again, I think there's no doubt in my mind that they will make one eventually, and that Scott will return for a hat trick, essentially. I don't know if he'll make 3 prequels and then having Prometheus sort of leading up to that. But as far as I understand it, he wants to make a lot of movies. But, you know, that is, of course, subject to change. But in regards to having one more sequel to Alien Covenant, I think that's definitely well within the realms of possibility. And there's a lot of different things that they could explore. And given how awesome Alien Covenant was in regards to the ideas that it had, in regards to how it looked, I'm one of those people who likes the film quite a bit. I am very much looking forward to it. You know, the sky's the limit at this stage. And, of course, we haven't seen the director's cut of Alien Covenant either. And that could, of course, be quite interesting. I don't think we'll see any sort of additions to the film in regards to new ideas, but rather just extended scenes or additional lines of dialogue. You know, just sort of padding the movie out, so to speak, in the same sense that he did with Kingdom of Heaven. Anyways, guys, that's the essential gist, how I feel about the film. If you liked my video, feel free to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. Anything you can do to share helps. There's only so much that I can do myself, so anything you can do, I appreciate quite a bit. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay tuned for more videos. Take care, guys.